Here we go. All right. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. The first part was earlier this morning. It was focused on the learner. This 90 minutes will be focused on the learning. And then the third part this afternoon will be focused on a learner-centered ecosystem. With us, we have Dr. Ryan Crone, who's a superintendent from southeastern Wisconsin. He has decade experience plus with learner-centered practice, as well as he's worked with schools across the country on transforming and also re-energizing their schools. Without further ado, then I will pass it off to Ryan.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks to the EdTech team for having me here today, and welcome everybody. And as Michael said, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. And I see we have New Mexico and California on so far. Our last session, we had people joining throughout. We realize that people sometimes are doing this during the day and other pieces like that, and they're busy. Our session today is part 2. As Michael said, we started off this morning with talking about the learner. And this is the part where we're going to talk about the learning experience. And then later at part 3, we get into the entire learner-centered ecosystem, our school districts, but even more beyond that, our communities and just learning across communities and things like that. Our session's designed to be pretty interactive. So we use everything from the chat box. We're going to use Jamboard in just a little bit, and as well as some reflective tools. And Michael will help make sure in the chat box that you have links to Jamboard, and you have links to pieces in terms of reflective tools and things like that. I'm going to move through a series of topics in terms of how we roll today. And the goal is to present some ideas. We have a theme of what we consider to be knowing, doing, and becoming. So we have a lot of different people on our calls in different roles, from educators to administrators to coaches. But we always think about, what is it about the ideas that we know? What is it about the ideas that we're doing already? And what is it about these ideas that we can imagine becoming a part of our system? And this whole work really started with the idea of imagine, and that's where we're going to start today. So I'm going to share my screen here and get started. By all means, please use the chat box if you need anything as we get started here today. We'll go from there. So as I mentioned before, this is part 2 of our learning series. And we start with an imagine statement. And the imagine statement is really about, imagine if learning was active, personalized, and served as the foundation for individual growth, creativity, and innovation. So we take learning, and not just talking about learning, but we push it beyond, and we think about sort of the learning experience itself. We think about it being personalized to the learner, which is what our part 1 was about, and really serve as a foundation really for individual growth, creativity, and innovation. We're going to dive into this today. In terms of this 3-part series, this is one of my favorite parts, because this is really like, I guess if you like Oreos, this is the double stuff moment of really getting some of the to the excitement of what we can do for learners, and then how we can sort of support that as a system. I mentioned knowing, doing, and becoming, and this is a really important concept as you're thinking about ideas, because in many ways you are representing yourself, but you're also representing your district or your teammates or your colleagues. And so as we think about ideas, we think a lot of this about in terms of, what do we know about really these active learning environments that are personalized, or what are we doing right now around this, or what is it that we hope to become? In many ways, we have seen many systems that have pockets of innovation, or places where things are happening, that people are doing certain things, but it maybe isn't systemic, or have a spot where people are talking about ideas or need to be talking about ideas. So we really use this continuum a couple of times in our sessions to reflect and think about where not only you are, but I also have you think about your team, your school, your system, in terms of this work and how it can play out. So this idea of knowing, doing, and becoming, and where you are. So here's a concept that we're going to get into, and it's just our first image of the day. And I'm just going to, the phrase I'm going to use is titled or, okay? And the idea of that is we can do what we're doing, or we can think about sort of how an or might help our system. And this is going to be a theme we're going to get in here today. And it's really a question that I ask myself in everything that I do, whether it's myself as a parent, as a coach, as an administrator, as a teacher, and this idea about really sort of these learning experiences, and what is it we can be doing, or what is it we're doing today, or what is it we could be doing in the future? And this image will make a lot more sense here in just a little bit. So this morning we talked about in part 1 that we all have boundaries. We have boundaries for organizations. We have boundaries for our system. We have boundaries for our companies. And these boundaries allow us to do things that we do. They're within our boundaries, or things that we don't do. They're outside of our boundary. And if you think about that from an organization or from a company standpoint and things like that, prior to COVID and prior to this disruption that we've all faced in many ways, we had a boundary of said that these are the things that we do. Michael mentioned superintendent. I mentioned this in the first session, but prior to COVID, our school system did not provide hybrid or virtual options. We were a school district that students came to and we served them in our school. We didn't have one-to-one devices. We didn't have an expectation of students logging in with Zoom. We didn't have board meetings that were virtual. We didn't connect with learning sessions. All of a sudden, via COVID, our model in terms of what we ask of our learners, our learning environment, and even our entire system has changed. And now, because of those boundaries, we've pushed ourselves outside of what we said in the past. We would have said we do this and we don't do that. We're starting to do new things. The whole concept of these imagine statements is to think about what students, families, communities, districts are facing as we've broken out of a traditional system of what we do. And not just a few people or a few ideas that have broken out, but an entire system with all learners in a spot that we're using new tools and new approaches and really thinking about how can we create dynamic learning experiences. Now, when the storyline about going back, when COVID is under control and going back, and people have talked about that, one of our concepts from this morning is about keep going forward with certain ideas. And that's what we're going to get into today, is thinking about what are the ideas that we broke through a traditional model for that we see high value in and that we want to keep going forward with. So a crisis that we're facing is there upon most of our doorsteps. But at the bottom, the quote really talks about a crisis can be a catalyst or can speed up changes that are on the way. And it can almost serve as an accelerant. So as more and more students, and I mentioned our own system, we're offering options for virtual and hybrid. We're offering one-to-one devices. We've created platforms for students to learn. We're going to get into the learning experiences that we are doing now, offering greater amount of voice and choice, offering a better opportunity for changing how students are demonstrating learning, how educators are recording learning and looking at a collection of evidence in their work, and the tools that we're using to make some of this possible. And most importantly, how we cannot go back away from these things, but how we can continue to go forward and include some of these technology tools and strategies as a part of our classrooms going forward. So this idea here in this image is to really think about what boundaries we used to be in, how we can break through with some of these learning experiences and create a whole new set of things that we do as an educational system. And again, our purpose of doing this is for our learners. We're going to talk today about linking the learner and the learning. We're going to talk about redefining the learning experience. And we're going to get into some questions and discussions as we go. So this is our chance to use the chat box or to unmute yourself and answer. Does anybody know the answer to this equation? I'm going to watch the chat box here for a second. Does anybody know the answer to this equation or have a guess? I don't want to use too much wait time, but you can use your smart device if you want. Does anyone know the answer? I won't volunteer anybody to give their answer. I do see what's on here. Anybody know the answer? Oh, we've got an answer. Thank you, Kim. Kim, you win a prize. Kim said, oh, got two answers. So we put it in there. All right. I'm going to say yes from a mathematical standpoint and no from what this answer is. The answer to this question, in terms of how we have it, there it is, Kim, is the school year. Kim, amazing. That is the answer. This is the school year for the most part. And as you think about it, I don't know, Kim, what your description would be, but this equation is generally how schools are designed, all the way from the contract level to the schedule level to the year, where one teacher is with a batch of students, I just put 28, for a certain number of minutes, maybe it's a 52-minute class period. Maybe it's 6 periods a day, 5 days a week, 180 school days, depending on what you have. And 13 years includes kindergarten. Maybe it's 13.5 with 4K. We never know what we have. So Kim, you get a double prize for thinking about the school year. But generally, this is the school year. And it's an equation that is so dominant in our system that it goes all the way down to individual contracts and structures and schedules. And we build so many things around this equation. And this equation equals school. And because of that, there are so many things associated with school that we would have, and certain words that would be associated with school. And we're going to get to this in a second, but thinking about words related to school, which could be schedules and desks and class lists and other things like that. The question that we have is, well, that equals school, the question that we're faced with right now is what actually equals learning. And the idea here is to think about that traditional equation that was one teacher with certain students for a certain number of time has been blown out of the water. Systems all over the place have been asking themselves to change the equation. And to change the equation, to ask themselves, what equals learning? Do you always have to have one teacher with a certain set of students? Because at times we know that one-to-one, a teacher with one student is a great equation. A teacher with 100 students works when you're delivering certain information. No teacher is available for allowed learning to occur, or class size, or thinking about the number of minutes, why is it that time is the constant and learning is the variable so often, versus getting a chance to start to ask ourselves, what would be the minutes, number of days, number of courses, number of classes. The exciting part of the silver lining moment about the educational system having to be forced into an innovative model through this crisis is that people have changed the equation in a variety of ways, from hybrid and virtual days to extended class periods to giving students more time to have on their own for independent time or time to be more empowered. And this equation keeps changing. The idea here in this section is to really think about what is your equation that is equaling learning. And even more specifically, what was missing in the first equation was the instructional strategies and the control that we have to add that as to be a part of our equation in the learning experience. Generally, again, putting a teacher with a batch of students for a certain time of day for a certain number of days during the year creates a structure that we work within. And now that that structure has been broken, our thinking is really about what equals learning and what some of those pieces might be. We're going to take some idea. We're going to do our first opportunity here to look at words that are associated with school and words that are associated with learning. And the idea here is to really separate the two. This morning, we talked about looking at what are some words that are associated with the learner and the learning. Today, we're going to really start with a similar activity. What is it that looks like that's associated with school, words that follow that general equation, versus words that get into learning? We're going to use a tool called Jamboard, and some of you have used that this morning. What we're going to do, and it's going to be in the chat, Michael will put that in there, but by going to Jamboard, I'm going to just model this here quick in case you haven't. For those of you who are on this morning, we'll do that. Our Jamboard activity was filled up this morning with a number of pieces, and I'll scroll to the one that we're going to have here for today. This is an idea, and I just put it in here. The idea here for the Jamboard is to take a Post-it note, and you can write things that are associated with school and with learning. We just want to see a collection of our thoughts here today. We also want to practice using this Jamboard tool because we're going to use it a few different times in this presentation here today. So again, if you don't mind using that link and navigating over, and then we're going to practice adding some sticky notes and writing in some words that are associated with school, and then versus those that are associated with learning. So I'll challenge yourself to put a couple on each side if you can. And we're really going to set the tone here to separate what is school versus what is learning and how we can go there. So we're going to set the tone here. And thank you. It looks like we've got the anonymous dolphin and a crocodile and other people joining us and things like that. So thank you. Looks like it's working for some of us to get over to the link, and thank you for that. I like the different colors of Post-it notes. Give it about another 30 seconds. We've got a great sample size starting here. All right. Feel free to keep adding as I'm talking, but I want you to just look at the words that we're sharing. Again, these are words coming from all of us in the audience here today that represent, really all of us across the country, and Canada was on, and things like that. And as you start to see, we're going to spend our time today talking about, this side of the equation. Okay. We're going to spend our time talking about learning. And we're going to try to dismiss a little bit about school. Now, that does not mean that it's not important or that this doesn't provide the structure for us doing the learning, but we're going to really try to talk about what is learning, because this is going to free us to think about how all these pieces, from project-based learning strategies to student exploration to the learner's role to having fun, to having the level of independence, how these things add to this equation and really are a part of the equation, versus allowing these things to dominate the equation. And that's the piece that, as a superintendent, in some of the work that I've done over the years, has always been struggling to me, where we allow things to sort of get in the way of the learning, or it doesn't create an optimal learning environment, or it makes it very challenging for educators to start to do these things because of bells and curriculum and schedule and rules and deadlines and some of these other things that get in the way of this. I think if we were to put out a vote to families, to educators, to students, and really to administrators in terms of what we want to see in the day, we're going to see this side of learning. It's going to be very intuitive to us. So we have to make sure that we find a way to do this, even though we're still within a structure. Part 3 is we're going to break down this structure a little bit more about a learning ecosystem and how we can start to chip away at this. And even today, we're going to talk about what we can do as a first step with these things and how we can go away. Our concept that you're going to hear me say a couple times is what I would call simple. And I say our work has to be simple enough that we can do it tomorrow, that a teacher can design a lesson and start to incorporate some of these things tomorrow. At the same time, simple stands for the systemic implementation of powerful learning experiences. So I'll say that again. The systemic implementation of powerful learning experiences has to be simple. It has to be simple enough for a teacher designing their next lesson plan to incorporate many of your sticky notes. It has to also be systemic, that over time, we're able to start to address the school side of things so that we're supporting the learning side with a school-based or learner-centered system. So thank you for playing with Jamboard. I'm going to go back to the slides here a second, and I'll present again. So our idea here today is to go and start to think about that piece. This is our first pause moment. And one of the pause moments I'm going to do, you're going to see this image a lot. We're going to talk a lot about, when you think about really that equation, what is it that you know about your current equation right now? What is it you're doing to start to define sort of a learning equation versus a school equation? And what do you hope to become? Marco has also placed a reflection sheet in your in the chat box. This is just a note-taking form. There's nothing that we're going to kind of use on that, but it's going to guide us in what I would call some thoughtful reflection on the ideas that I'm presenting today. So as our opener today, we just shared a little bit about the difference of an equation of school versus learning, and really thinking about how, when we've had this time to break out of, because of COVID, and break out of some of our traditional models, for the most part, I heard educators and families and administrators talking about how can we ensure learning's happening, and what are the new parts in the new equation that we have to ensure great learning experiences. Now, while many of us want to get back to some of the things that we can't do, like hands-on, collaborative, face-to-face learning experiences in school that school and face-to-face provides, we've also started to talk about what's the equation in terms of the role of the learner, what's the equation of the strategies that we can use, and how can some of these things come to life. And that's what we're going to dive in here today. I'm really excited about this section. Again, the reflection tool here is really simply put of where are you at in terms of knowing about this idea, where are you at right now in terms of doing this work, and where are you at in terms of looking at this becoming a part of your system. So here's the image that we're going to talk about in terms of just knowing. We're going to talk about what's a learner-driven learning experience. We're going to talk about what makes learning most effective. And we're also going to get into what are the intended benefits, or sort of the preferred state of where we hope to be. This image is how I see the school year, each and every year. This is an image of a river, and a river having a current that sort of guides us. And I would say that current is really about sort of what schools do to get kids from from their home into the school day, with having teachers and people help motivate, and schedules to follow, and assignments due. And there's this current of energy around the school year going from point A to point B. This could even be sort of in a lesson in terms of how students are learning and going. And really in sort of this current, the idea is to really think about the natural energy that school produces. But at some point in time, this journey comes to an end, a formal current journey of school. And what we find is at the end of it is we're in a lake or in an ocean or in a spot where the current might not be there. And it's time for the learner to navigate their own learning journey. And we're going to get into those concepts a little bit. But we're going to talk about of this current, how is that good for kids? And at the same time, how can we have students start to navigate their learning journey? In this next picture, in terms of this piece, you see a picture of a similar river, and I want you to take a look at the boat that's close up here and start to think about, this is a picture of what I would consider to be really an educator-owned or educator-controlled experience. We're most likely going from point A to point B. We're most likely getting a chance to go past a number of other experiences. But really, the idea here is, what is the learner's role in this experience? Or what is the educator's role in this experience? And as you can see, we mentioned it right at the start of our session today, that question of the or being in the hands here of the educator and not necessarily in the hands of the learner. You can see that learner is more of a passive recipient of the experience. They are probably learning a lot about history or architecture, or industry or other pieces on this learning journey or this aspect of it. And you can see the educator is doing some work in terms of moving from point A to point B, or to design sort of this experience or this route. If I go and take a little bit of a shift here on one more piece, we're going to talk about shifting the or. And in this case, shifting the or into the hands of the learner. A part of this journey is something that they can control. Now you can see in this image, it's changed a little bit. You can see now that we have a co-ownership. The educator still has their hands on an or. He also has some short shorts on that matches that of the team. We can also see that the or is in the hands of the learner. And we've seen a pretty big shift, even in the position that the educator is now in. And it almost looks like with body language in terms of what's happening in this experience. You can see some of the oars are in the water, some of the oars are not. You can see that the educator is probably doing some positioning, maybe less about the direction that they're headed and more about how students can get there themselves. As I look at this image compared to the last image, in terms of the educator was in the back with the oar in the hand, looking at where they're going. In this position, the educator's in the front, but the students are looking at where they're going and they're starting to navigate it. This is a really critical moment. This is a moment that really happened that I think when we shifted to a lot of virtual or hybrid models during COVID, which was students were now in a position to have to navigate their day, to have to manage their own behavior, to have to advocate for themselves and their needs. It wasn't as upfront and obvious to us to be able to see where students were in the learning journey, whether they were present in class, whether they were doing work, whether they were attending, whether they had questions and needs and concerns. This is the moment of frustration where we can say it was probably a lot easier and less choppy to do the work ourselves to go to point A to point E, but it's also the moment of thinking about this work. Now the boat looks like it's still heading in a direction. And the key word that we're going to talk about here in terms of learning is that they're learning about how to navigate their learning journey while they are learning. And that's one of the key takeaways for this section is what's the role of our learner while they are learning? Not that they're stopping their learning journey, but they're actually navigating their learning journey. And our third picture on this storyline here today, before we get into discussion, is really thinking about that the or here is going to stand for ownership, agency, and responsibility. I mentioned shifting the or, but at the same time, really thinking about the or in the hands of learner is shifting the ownership, the agency, and the responsibility, and shifting it from the hands of the educator into the hands of our learners. And thinking about the instructional strategies and tools that do that, and put students in a position to be able to navigate their learning journey. And how do we teach those skills and responsibilities? What I've loved about the silver lining of this COVID era is that we've been positioned in so many ways to engage families, to engage learners, and to use strategies that are asking students to do this. And while it takes some time to get some of these spots going, and while there's still some challenges ahead of us, we are seeing more and more students owning their daily schedule, owning the uploading of assignments, owning the assessment and feedback process, owning the opportunity to reach out and get resources and find support. So this image is really the end image that we're looking for, which is putting students in the level of responsibility where they have the or in their hand for when there is no more current to move them from A to B, which would be sometimes teachers motivating and parents and due dates and other things. when they face challenges like the road ahead, or when they need to design their own direction. The shift that has happened here and sort of the spot that we're looking at is really thinking of our school system again as a river and having a current and momentum and a clear kind of direction of what class you're in, what grade you're in, what structure you're in, all of those kind of things. But recognizing that our goal during that journey is to really make a shift in terms of the ownership, agency, and responsibility in terms of who's navigating that journey and what is our role. When I say what is our role, I say what is our role as a school system and our role as educators to put ourselves in a position to be able to shift that oar and to have the confidence and the strategies to do that. I mentioned before about the idea of while. Our goal is to develop and nurture these powerful learners while they are learning. With the idea that as they're learning math today, what are the skills that we're asking them to do, from collaborate or find resources or advocate for themselves or self-assess, so that they're able to do those same skills across multiple classrooms and utilize those same skills going forward. So our first pause here, and I just threw a quick story at you, is I want you to do a little reflection in terms of, before we get into the deep dive on this, is what does this storyline mean to you in terms of shifting the oar? What is it that you know already about what I've just shared? What is it that you're doing strategically in your own classroom, in your own system about this shift and sort of the shift in ownership instructionally? And what is it that you might hope to become as a part of your system intentionally and systematically in terms of this work? So I'm going to take about a 2-minute pause, and we're going to come back to either do some sharing in the chat or some sharing with your microphones off. So take about a minute, use a reflection tool document that we've shared, or just jot your own notes. But as the story that I just shared, how did that hit you in terms of what you already know, what you're already doing, or what you hope to become, and where you're at in this process of this journey? As you reflect, if you would like to add something to the chat box, just a comment, a statement, it really helps to get the conversation going, just something to share. Again, another minute. All right. If anybody would like to share, again, turn your mic off and just share a comment if you'd like to add it in the chat box as well. The idea here is setting the tone this morning as we get into learning strategies is to really make sure that we're thinking about our learning strategies through what the learner is doing. Not what the educator is necessarily doing, but what the learner is doing and what position we put them in to nurture a powerful learner while they're becoming a proficient student. So it looks like Kim has shared. Thank you, Kim. And as you can see in the chat box, Kim being a coach, trying to encourage teachers to let go of some of the responsibility without fear or guilt. Really powerful statement there, Kim, and definitely not an easy task to get over the threshold because as you saw in the first picture in the gondola ride, in the boat where the educator had the oar and was in the back and navigating, it was a pretty controlled environment and you're pretty confident in terms of what the educator can get from point A to point B. But to put the oar in the hands of the learners to think about them getting to point A to point B is definitely a shift in ownership and trust or fear that they can't get there. Other comments, anyone? We're gonna keep going. We're gonna build off this idea. And actually, Kim, I just want to thank you again for putting that in there, because one of the pieces in here is the fear that it's not going to work, or the fear that we're not going to get as far in our curriculum, or the fear of those things. But one of the things that has really driven me the most, though, is the fear that our school system doesn't provide kids an opportunity to practice this enough, that when they leave our classroom, when they leave our grade level, when they leave our school, and they leave our district, that it's the first time they're having to look for those skills to develop them, rather than our schools intentionally developing these pieces. As we think about an investment in the learner and not just the learning, we balance our approach of looking at what our journey is. And really, ultimately, to make our system really be sustainable and be powered, we need it to be powered by everybody in our system, and students really doing a lot of this work where they're able to self-assess, where they're able to advocate for themselves, where they're able to find resources, and they really become the driver of their learning experience. This next piece that we're going to get into here a little bit, we're going to talk about some specific examples of where this is happening, and then some tools to get it started and start making it happening. So the real question for us reflectively is, so if we're at the spot where learners maybe don't have the oar in their hand as much as we want them to, what do we need to, what is our current state in terms of where are we now as a classroom? And again, a lot of individuals might talk about what they're doing, but what is it happening across your building or across your system? And what is our preferred state to get to? Do we want this all the time, or is this something we want to do systemically? What will educators need to make the shift? So in that comment we just saw, from fear to support to coaching to strategies, and really just a first step. Again, that simple mindset of what is it simple that I can do today that will be systemic and I can rely on tomorrow? And again, what will students need, in terms of patience and understanding of really putting them in a position to do this work? So those are our questions we're going to lead with in this next part in terms of where we work. So here's a concept, a very simple concept. I've used the word simple a lot, but I also think it's important. And the concept is of while. And I've said it a couple of times, but I want it to sink in, and I have a visual here we're going to use and we're going to build upon here. The idea is to think about, we still want students to have a high level of learning, which is going to be the vertical axis here. And we think about that, let's say at the top here is about really students and our goal is to reach a high level of learning versus a low level of learning or no learning. So if we still want that piece, the idea is, how are we going to get there? The horizontal line here, in terms of where we're at, is really thinking about, consider that to be what I would call an empowerment continuum. We're on one end here on this far corner. As you look at it on the right side, this is about students being empowered. Maybe in the middle is about them being engaged. And then the far end is potentially disengaged, or sort of a direction we don't want, where they don't see themselves very passive. Our goal is to think about getting into this quadrant right here. Is that how can we nurture a powerful learner while they're becoming a proficient student? And really thinking about this word while is, what's the experience that's going to do this? When you think about students learning something, what's the role they can play in doing this work? This next slide gets at this a little bit more detail. And it's a really simple concept, but what learning experiences or designs get us here into this quadrant where there's a high level of learning and a high level of empowerment? The idea is to think about this from the lens of, we have a chance to design experiences for kids that have them use both of these skills, where they're learning and they're in control of their learner. And I mentioned that with the shift of the or, and we're going to get into some of the details of the or in this work. The idea here, again, is for us to think about what we can do as educators to get into this role. This is a tool that I have used in multiple schools, in multiple lessons, where we've drawn on a simple piece of paper this quadrant, where we've defined what it looks like, what we want for a high level of learning at the end of an algebra unit of study or social studies, and where we've designed what we want the student's role to be in terms of their ability to self-assess or find resources or things. So at the end of it, we've actually had this drawn on a whiteboard or on poster board, and have students put an X or their initials or a little dot in what quadrant they thought they fell in, their own self-assessment. Could be at the end of a lesson, at the end of a week, at the end of a unit of study. The teachers are looking to see students self-assess, and obviously our goal is to have students be in a quadrant where they felt they had a high level of learning and they were able to drive their learning. But you'll see students where they said they learned a lot, but they didn't really have an active role, or maybe they didn't learn as much and they did have an active role. The point of it is to have students start to think about this strategically, as well as educators, and think about how to use a simple 1-minute assessment tool to have students reflect on where they are. And even more importantly for educators, think about what strategies they use to get kids into this quadrant as they go forward. In our school, we took this continuum, we took another step forward on it, and we built what we call our own engagement continuum. The engagement continuum was designed in a way to really link the learner and the learning. I apologize for that background noise. But the learner and the learning, where we talk about students being a passenger on that boat, being the co-captain, or being really learner navigated. And we looked at it through the lens of some questions about what you want to learn and how you're going to learn it, how you're going to show it, and thought about things being more structured. This is really, as you can see, more controlled or guided and really free. And you'll see this is really part of a gradual release model and many other concepts in terms of active inquiry processes and how these navigate. But really what we look at is what's the learner role? And we look at sort of questions in terms of where we are going. Bringing this back to the idea of this quadrant gives us a chance to think about, we want students to have a high level of learning in our courses, and we want them to play an active role. Are we clear in terms of areas that we can do that? We started with just thinking about how you're going to learn something, or how you can demonstrate your learning, or even what you're going to learn depending on what these passion projects were. And we looked at all the ways we could shift the or. So here's some strategies that we just looked at in terms of what we thought about it. What are these strategies in terms of offering more choice, offering more inquiry, offering more authentic assessments, conferring deeper learning, project-based learning, or even other blended learning methods that we're seeing that could put students in these positions in terms of where they're going. These were strategies that we saw an opportunity for educators to not only have in their hands, but to shift into the, were strategies that shifted the or into the hands of the learner. And the idea here again is that by using many of these strategies, we're looking for ways that develop the learner while they are learning. Back to that question, while. I'm going to give an example here of a couple of scenarios. Here's 3 stories I want to just share, and then we're going to have you reflect on some of your own experiences. The first one is about turning over an assessment. I'm going to just slide the, bring this thing back. The idea here, as I mentioned on this slide, which is evidence and how you show it. And what was generally educator controlled, moving it into learners having greater control of how they can demonstrate their learning. The idea here on what we pushed for was we looked at some authentic assessment experiences as an or that we were going to use. And we looked at putting it into the hands of the learner. And we called it the assessment turnover project. This was done at a high school with about 100 staff. To start the year, we asked the staff, how many of you are willing to turn over an assessment to your students this year? And amongst the staff, there was a few staff that said, well, something I already do. There was others that said that we've never done that. There were places that said they couldn't dream of that. And the concept was really thinking about what strategy can we do if we turned over the assessment and just said, pick one assessment that you can turn over to the hands of the learner and let them demonstrate their understanding in whatever choice they wanted or whatever medium they wanted. A pretty simple concept. The staff voted to try it. Everyone was going to try it one time this first semester. I went back to that school at the end of the semester for a reflection on how things went. We did a sharing out of this experience. And there was 2 comments that were made over this collection that really were transformational to the entire organization. The first comment was, there were some teachers that talked about the challenges that they had turning this over. And there was other teachers that talked about the success they had in turning this over. One of the things that we found that emerged in that conversation was the teachers that tried to do this in September and in October in the beginning of the year found significant trouble with students understanding how to take ownership of this experience, to manage their time, to find resources, and really understand the learning targets and how they could show it, versus students that had done it more at the end of the semester in December and January. The dialogue really became that the students were saying, oh, we did this already in math class, or we did something similar in science. And what the teachers didn't realize in the beginning, and what was the silver lining, was that the students were having 6, 7, 8, 9 opportunities to practice this across the first semester with once in each course that they took. And all of a sudden the students were starting to find out ways to demonstrate their voice, to use choice, and to find ways to show their learning experience. That was the first piece of recognizing that the more student practice that they had in having the or in their hands, and in this case, an assessment in their hands, that they're able to start to develop those skills and hone those skills, no different than they would hone the skills in math or reading or writing. But it was some of these powerful learner skills. The second silver lining, which I think stunned everybody in the room, was the teachers reported knowing their students better than they've ever known them before because of an assessment. And I'll say that again because it was one of the most transformational moments in the dialogue, was that they saw students as individuals more so than they ever have, because they saw students sharing passions, interests, talents, perspective, and personality through an assessment. Not through a get to know you activity, but through an assessment. And that really shaped the game for students, for understanding that these dynamic experiences could be turned over, that there wasn't as much fear. That school district decided to do that again the second semester of the school year, and they would pick one more assessment. By the end, the success that students were finding and the joy and the benefit that it was having to the learning experience, because again, this was simple and systematic, the benefit became something that the school just decided to make systemic as a part of their system, to the point that they talk about students doing this activity 8 times a semester, 16 times in a year, and over 64 opportunities in a 4-year high school experience for students to have ownership and voice and how they can present and demonstrate their learning and defend it, which was many of the learner skills that they wanted students to have, but it became systemic, and that was a part of their instructional strategy and culture. Again, a simple place to start, but a powerful and systemic model to be able to shift the oar into the hands of the learner through assessments. I have 2 other examples that I'll talk about a little bit shorter in this, and then we're going to turn it over to your own reflection and thinking about where it's happening now and what you know and where we might go systemically. The second one was called Show Me. It was a simple math approach where students, where they were getting stuck, were raising their hands. And math teachers in the department were talking about that they were being helpful to kids by responding to the questions that they had. The questions, one of the steps that the educators took was to say, they just started saying, well, just show me your work, show me your notes, which started a conversation when they went to there, that students were starting to use their voice. And they noticed that the students were having a harder time taking notes and walking students through, or walking the teacher even through their thinking. They were just getting stuck. Well, the teachers took a second step with this, besides just show me your notes and walk me through it. They said, we're going to have you show me your work at the end of every assignment. So think of math and some daily assignments and some work that students are doing or practice problems. The idea was now that the math department was going to have students use different tools, different tech tools, different scratch pads and different whiteboards. And the students' assessment of whether their homework was done or not was whether they could show you by doing an assessment and teaching their peers. So they had students go into a whiteboard or go onto a scratch pad digitally, and they had to be able to solve problems without using their notes as a teacher would, be able to demonstrate their thinking and their understanding, and turning in these videos. It turned into where students, they could self-assess if they knew it or not. Other peers could watch them presenting to each other and say it didn't sound too confident with the vocabulary. And then they were recording these, and teachers were actually end up using these and saving them in Google Classroom as a part of, students would then go in and see how other teachers were, or other students and peers were solving problems, and the voice that they were using as a part of their assessment. A huge turnover there in terms of thinking about students and shifting the oar in terms of their responsibility of not only teaching, but self-assessing, and being able to solve problems more and find where they're getting stuck with each other, more so than sort of just stopping and not having the ability to sort of advocate for themselves. And the last one, a very simple one that I would share in the shifting of the oar, is a school district that had students start to, instead of turning in any written assignments, the school district started to talk about students highlighting areas of their writing assignment that they felt matched the standard. So in their Google Doc signing writing pieces, they would highlight sections of their writing, and in the comment section, they would post the standard of the learning target or the evidence that this is a spot where they felt showed evidence of some of the strategies that they were working on their writing piece. There was something they were doing in English, but it ended up becoming something that turned over into their social studies assignments and just writing in general, wanting students to not only be able to self-assess their writing, but just really understand the editing and evaluating process of their own writing, so that they weren't waiting for a teacher to do some red ink and hand it back to them a couple of days or weeks later, but they were in a spot where they were turning in with their own reflection, and even in the forefront a year or two later, getting a spot where they're self-correcting and advocating for themselves of, I'm getting stuck in this spot, or I don't know how to show my evidence. Those were 2 high school and a middle school option in terms of where we're going, but there's plenty of those out there. So I just took a spot to be able to talk about the idea of OR. And we're going to go to Jamboard right now. And I want us to just think about systemically. I told some stories about things that would help. I want us to think about what would help us move forward in shifting the OR more strategically or systematically in our system, versus what are some barriers to kind of doing this. And then again, in the chat box, somebody talked about fear or other things like that. So we're going to go to Jamboard right now. And we're going to look at just sharing some benefits to moving these ideas forward. And then we're going to break down some of these things a little bit more. And let me go to the right section. It's going to be Jamboard page 7. And then we'll talk about more examples, but right, we're going to get into a little bit of leadership for this, which is what's going to help us move forward with this idea, what are the benefits, and what are some potential barriers. All right, we're starting to get some in here. Again, we're on page 7 on Jamboard. We're starting to get some spots in there. Thank you. Again, we're thinking about the benefits to shifting the ore in our system. We're thinking about some barriers to shifting the ore because not always easily done, and have you move your slides in there. Another 30 seconds or so. All right. Thank you, everybody, for starting to put things in. I shared some ideas, and oftentimes when I shared 3 of those stories or more, you know, they always have a context behind them of a lot of barriers to overcome, a lot of whether that's mental models or mindsets or dispositions, whether it's about skills that we have or don't have in the system, whether it's just knowledge base of these pieces, whether it's students, whether it's community and systems. At the same time, the benefits of students, again, more guiding, less grading, culture of feedback and not failure, some of these benefits and things. Before we move on this journey about thinking about learning experiences and shifting the ore, obviously for all of us, we want to think about the transition that we're going to be faced against, and sort of the transition of sort of the fear, the transition of are we going to be able to cover content, the fear of whether students can do it. And it becomes one of those barriers to think about, do the benefits of doing this outweigh the barriers that we're routine, as well as do we have the patience to allow the benefits to emerge so that we can chip away at some of these barriers. Again, part 1 about thinking about the learner that we did this morning was really thinking about the learner and investing in them. And that's really what this side is about the benefit of really investing in here. It's also about the learning experiences and investing in strategies and investing in our educators in terms of their role and really valuing their role as nurturing powerful learners as much as valuing their role of covering content. Our part 3 today gets at the system approach today, or this afternoon, where we're going to really look at sort of these systems and routines and sort of this whole idea of what is our system designed for and what do we want to design it for. So thinking about benefits and barriers to this piece is one of the challenges to thinking about these strategies. Now, many of these strategies aren't new. We've heard about these concepts for long time, and they've been a part of schools forever. But the idea is thinking about really doubling down on these strategies in these schools and really thinking about imagining these becoming systemic again, and moving to a systemic model of our idea of the concepts that we're talking about is about us really recognizing ways that our organization can become systemic by thinking about overcoming some of these pieces. So we're going to go to our first sort of reflection piece again, and you can use the reflective sheet we got, but I'd like you to think about, imagine your organization where learning is active, personalized, and served as the foundation for individual growth, creativity, and innovation. I'd like you to just kind of write a powerful message about what this looks like. And then we're going to get into how we're going to build sustainable systems to promote these practices. But a powerful message is really about what is the experience in your classroom, what is the experience in your department, what is the experience in your school. If you were to talk to families, if you're going to share to the community, what is the experience? Our school is called Stone Bank, but what is the Stone Bank experience? And if we were to invite people in and invite them to experience Stone Bank, what are these powerful pieces, and let's imagine this. So just take a minute or two for a free write about a powerful statement. Think about this powerful message about what it looks like. And would it go on the side of the benefit? And does it draw in as people seeing a benefit to your system as we go? So about 1 minute. All right. Look at the chat feeds. Writing a powerful message, as you think about your message about your school's vision statement, mission statement, think about the learning experience that you want and taking time to define them. When we started part 1 this morning, we talked about the idea of a portrait of a graduate, the idea of really recognizing the value of a learner beyond just the number, and the idea of looking at a learner in terms of the 4 dimensions that they have, of not just the learning that they're going to do, but their character, their skills, and powerful dispositions. The idea of writing a powerful message about learning is to really start to define the expectations that we have for that learning equation. And if we're thinking about wanting learning to be, in this case, as you can see from our Imagine statement, it is active and personalized. It serves as a foundation for growth and creativity. And then turning that powerful statement into action, local action within lesson planning, local action within classrooms, and local action and experiences that can be seen and understood by our system. This whole piece in terms of understanding these learning environments and creating a statement is about starting to really define the learning experience for kids at a level that gets really granular, but at a level that really has a symbolic nature of really connecting to the learner and those learner skills. In some places, lessons and lesson design is left up to the individual educators, but yet in many places we're starting to see a shift. The COVID experience that we had, really, again, this is that example of this image of prior to COVID, there was many places that said, we do this and we don't do that. And then all of a sudden COVID happened, and a lot of our boundaries about, again, of things that we used to do or that we're doing now had changed. And it changed because of a crisis. Our goal right now is to sort of think about, instead of just going back away from this crisis, is to think about changing because of a benefit. The idea, again, mentioning of not doing an all or nothing, but recognizing the value that may have occurred. Again, when we see that, for example, and I mentioned our role, we saw that we had to shift our model into a one-to-one model to be able to offer Google Classroom experiences, to be able to put students in a position to schedule their day, to organize their work, to present some findings and other things like that. The idea is that many of the instructional strategies of giving students a greater voice and choice or control in their learning is something that we want to keep going towards. While we did it through a crisis experience, we also saw that this is something that we wanted to put in as a part of our school system. As a result, and systemically in thinking about this is we talk a lot about what are the instructional strategies that do empower our learners, that get us into that quadrant, and we use that XY axis to make sure that we're up into the quadrant of not only a high level of learning as the expectation, but students in a position to drive their own learning in a way that really allows them to be an active participant. Some of the ways that we're planning to do that systemically is to continue on with our virtual options for students. And again, even giving student a choice in how they're going to learn something live, face-to-face, virtual, or hybrid model is the first step. Other ways that we're looking at doing this is oftentimes you'll see districts that will have a course selection guide that allows students to choose what class they're going to take, and the key word being what class. But how oftentimes do students have a course selection guide that they can choose how they want to learn it? Do I get to take US history, or do I get to take US history in a project-based format fashion? Do I get to take hands-on math, or do I get to take math and leave that strategy there? So our goal in really breaking apart the shift of the OR is to make it simple enough to have it happen today, but to think about how we can become a system that really requires these active experiences to happen and puts the choice into students' hand. In our own system, one of the things that we're celebrating is that we just verified that in our school district calendar for next year, we've added virtual days. It's the very first time our school calendar has had a couple of virtual days. And the reason for doing it at first is going to be symbolic, but it is strategic down the line. We believe that the steps we've taken with engaging families and students virtually, by sort of trying to close the digital divide, by providing tools and solutions tools for students in learning and for staff, is something that we see continuing to go forward with in the future. We wanted to engage families in understanding the platform that our school district is no longer just a building, but it's also that learning is sort of has an anywhere, anytime access piece, or a 24/7 model that has students be able to access some of their learning resources via Google Classroom. The students are going to be out in the future, that the learning can continue, and that many of these tools that our educators are using to be able to allow students to engage differently are things that we're going to want to be part of our portfolio. And while it won't be an all or nothing like we found in the crisis, it definitely, as you can see at the quote at the bottom, is this: we see this as a catalyst to speed up changes that are on their way and kind of almost serve, in terms of the work that we're doing, as an accelerant. As of a year ago, we were not a one-to-one district. We are now. As of a year ago, we weren't a system that utilized Google Classroom for all our coursework. We are now. As a year ago, we didn't put time and effort and energy into recognizing the digital divide and making sure that students had equitable access. It's now a primary focus of ours. And as of a year ago, we didn't have as many students scheduling their day, working on their own learner profile, or be in a position to have the oar in their hands of how they're demonstrating their learning. And we are now. And those are areas that were some silver linings that we found that we didn't want to go back in terms of our instructional strategies. While we will come back and we will continue to push on many of the other oars that we saw in terms of project-based learning and other pieces, our goal was to really think about where did we break through on these boundaries. And now, instead of saying we do this and we don't do that, we want to say we do this, and we've added some other pieces to our portfolio for the benefit of students, not only for the benefits of investing in a powerful learner, but for the benefits of engaging families, for the benefits of breaking down some equity and models for inclusive learning and experiences and things like that. One of the pieces that we're going to reflect on here is to think about ways in which the system has failed the learning experience. And also to think about ways in which the system is thriving with the learning experience, given what we have found today with sort of some of the COVID challenges. And again, this gets at where it says at the bottom about returning back to normal, or reimagining things and continuing to move forward. As you think about these pieces that I just shared, I'd like you to think a little bit about your own list that you have in terms of the work that you're doing, in terms of, and again, this is on our reflection sheet, but just thinking about ways, are there things that you're doing now because of this crisis or because of some of the challenge that we face that you see as having high value and continuing, or as a benefit to that will benefit the learning experience? As well as, are there areas that you're saying that in the past you want to make sure if you go back, you don't go back to some of the old ways that we're going? So I'm going to just pause for a second, and hopefully again we'll do some sharing on this. So pause one more minute and just think about this piece, and we're going to be doing some reflection on this in a second. as you're thinking and as you're writing, I'm going to just throw a couple of topics out there. Last night on Twitter, I saw somebody ask, how will your instruction be different when you're able to teach completely face-to-face or when this model is over? Or in another way, what we're asking today is how has your work changed or can continue to be changed because of this environment that we're seeing, and sort of what are your takeaways? We are seeing people respond with instructional learning models such as going gradeless, sort of stopping point systems and really focusing more on a collection of evidence or student work. We are seeing more and more passion projects and authentic assessments coming in to the work that we are seeing. Again, we're seeing more and more use of technology tools that allow students to collaborate not only in class, but outside of class for digital projects, and sort of offering us a chance for some hybrid, even if students are live, having a hybrid model where one day a week allows them to sort of be in a virtual experience with their classroom, where we're harnessing the power of the educator, but we're also harnessing the power of the collective network of kids, sort of keeping that technology as a part of the classroom. Where Zoom meetings used to be awkward and we didn't know how to now their way of shaping forms. We have some educators finding ways to have more and more inclusive conferences with families via Zoom, and students sharing more of their work even with parents via Zoom meetings, and continuing those pieces in terms of where they're going. We have other people that have talked about instructional strategies that continue to shift or just in terms of deeper learning experiences, in terms of allowing students, again, that greater access for giving them choice in how they're going to learn something, where they can learn to find more resources. They've learned to use more videos in their classrooms. They've allowed students to find other resources for learning about something and greater choice in there. So those would be areas that, as we think about this piece, again, about learner profiles, about learning experiences, and in this case, these dynamic experiences, is to really think about and pinpoint as your system in terms of where you're going. As we go forward, this is the double S curve that we've talked about this morning, and I'll bring it back here today. The S curve is really about, in terms of the learning experience, what was idea A, what is idea B that you're thinking about moving towards? If we think about this world in the terms of the COVID situation that we faced, what is it that you were doing in your system that got disrupted? And what did the disruption do to transform your thinking about that school equation, about what is school versus what is learning? And now we have a whole new experience for kids, for educators, for parents, for our communities, and for our systems, that we can get to the spot and we think about, well, are we looking to jump back to the old way of thinking with many of our ideas? Or is there something in here in this disruption that's going to allow us to keep going forward, or moving really from idea A to idea B? As I mentioned, some of the strategies that in the storylines here, or the teachers that shifted an assessment into the hands of the learner, their system ultimately transformed. But at first, it was down here. The gap or the transition or the transformed experience caused people to say it wasn't as efficient, maybe even as effective. And this goes back to the educator being in the front of the boat and giving the oar to the hands of the learners, where you're not feeling like you're as efficient as you want to be. But eventually, as the students learn to row and use that oar correctly, or in a position where we're starting to see the benefit of of the reason for investment, we're getting to the spot here where their system has changed and there's almost no going back. It's really the same for students in their role. When we find learning experiences that have the students take on the role of more of an active participant, where they are advocating for themselves and learning these skills, it drives the experience differently and changes the role of the educator. Not just changes the role of the learner, but it changes the role of the educator to be more of a guide and to be more of an academic success coach than it does over here, where you're a little bit more driving the experience, where you're trying to be a motivator and be the content expert versus one who's an expert in giving feedback and coaching. So again, this a double S curve piece is a powerful image, I believe, in thinking about what's really happening in terms of transforming our thinking, transforming the experience, and now transforming the system. Another way to look at this with instruction is to really think about, how do we move from sort of an instruction-based or that school equation with technology to a learner-centered ecosystem with technology? And the goal there, again, is to really think about, in this piece, how is technology and many of these tools allow us to really make this shift, to be able to have sort of hybrid solutions, to be able to meet students more often, to be able to see a variety of issues in terms of where things are going. So this double S curve piece, as you're reflecting on your next steps, is going to be an area that we're going to have you reflect on in terms of what were the ideas that you had, what's an idea that you had moving forward, and how can we really make the shift? And is it technology that's assisting that? Is it a new learner-centered equation that's shifting that? Or is it the new role of students or educators in there? So we're going to shift to some time to do some independent work for about 7 or 8 minutes here. And we call it sort of our reflection with our rule of 3. So our reflection here today on this experience, and I threw a lot at us in this session, is where do you see opportunities to move forward? And where do you see getting back, and why? So if you see areas to move forward, what is it that you want to move forward to? And what are these opportunities you're looking to do? If you see that you want to get back to something, to the other S curve, what is it that you want to get back to and why, to make sure that it really aligns to your values? When we hear we want to get back to have sometimes I'll hear we want to get back and have all the kids in class. I have to ask why. If the why is because it allows for more time for collaborative hands-on learning or to be able to do A, B, or C, it's a great why. If the why is about control and teaching the lesson and getting back, having kids not have the aura, the responsibility in hand, it's a challenge of, well, how can we get back, but how can we continue to move forward? The rule of 3 processing for the next 7 or 8 minutes, what we're going to ask you to do is to think about your top questions of what you're reflecting upon in terms of where do you see moving forward and where do you see getting back, but to see what you can do to take action. And again, this is on the reflection sheet, but thinking about, okay, in the next 3 hours, what is it that you could do to help what you had written down moving forward get some traction? It might be to write some goals. It might be to find a resource. It might be to make a connection. In the next 3 days, what's something that you could do to formalize what you see? It might be talking to some colleagues. It might be formalizing a plan. It might be connecting and some action planning, as well as in the next 3 weeks. The reason that this is in here is so often we go to conferences, we run a professional development session, we hear something, and we really don't take time to write down the next step in terms of what we're doing. And the next thing that we find ourselves doing is looking at our email, we get an inbox, and we get pushed back to the system that we've been working in before here. But if you see an area to move forward, one of the things you're going to have to ask, and again, this was on the reflection of what is it that you know right now or need to know? What is it you're doing right now or think you need to do? And what is it you hope to become in this process? And really, where can we start to plan time in our own day to make sure that some action happens in this stuff in terms of the next 3 hours, 3 days, and 3 weeks? The 3 hours one is challenging, but it's really about what are you going to do with your notes? What are you going to do with next steps? What are you going to do with a follow-up? Even if it's calendaring that 3 days from now, you'll take some action on things like this. So we're going to go about 6, 7, 8 minutes here for reflection. And then we're going to come back to end this part 2 section with some dialogue, next steps, and connection. So we'll be back in about 7 minutes using your rule of 3. And we'll be back at 12:15 for the last 15 minutes for conversation. Again, just about 2 more minutes with the goal of being precise with some opportunities you see in the rule of three. And we're going to do some sharing out and questions here in just 2 minutes. All right, I'm going to bring it back here just a little bit. Um, One of our goals here to close is to make sure we get some questions and conversation going a little bit more about the concepts that we brought up today. And the idea here of the reflection is to really think about action that you can take systemically from in terms of if you're going to focus on students and educators or parents, focus on instructional practices or leadership for this and coaching, as well as some organizational themes for departments, or even some structures, frameworks, and policies. Our goal here to move into sort of these pieces from part two is to think about, again, if we want to imagine that learning is active, personalized, and served as a foundation for individual growth, creativity, innovation. Really, what do we need to know about this piece, and what do we know now? What do we need to do, or what are we doing about this, and what do we hope to become? We get into part three a little bit later this morning or this afternoon. We're going to talk about sort of the entire system, but today, right now, in this part, we're just trying to talk about what we can do instructionally and how these link together. So I'm going to stop my sharing right now, and then we're going to just go into some dialogue in case there are some questions. So thoughts or comments, you can put it in the comment section. We'll go kind of from there. All right, we've got a comment in there. Thank you. What types of reflective questions are you asking your teachers when uh, the year ends? Really, many of the ones that are in this presentation talk about, what we saw. We always start with the learner, but what did we, when we hear about something that, whenever I hear about what a student is not doing or couldn't do, I ask ourselves, how intentionally are we in investing in that skill or that habit of mind or that strategy? And I say that because systemically we're designed to teach kids to read, write, and do some learning. And then we, all of us collectively, when the students are not, we take that accountability for that. I try to have the same level of accountability for learner skills and learner dispositions that we do for reading skills and reading levels. And so we ask, when we talk about what our students need to do or what we wish they would do, we try to find a way to design learning experiences to have them practice that. It's sort of, you become a better driver every time you drive. And it's sort of one of those pieces that we think we can nurture a more powerful learner every time they learn if we are asking them to use and draw upon those learner skills. But our goal has been to really narrow that into what's the challenge that teachers are having. I heard again the other day that students are not turning in their work or doing homework. What a great question. Is that a question about students' motivation? Is that a question about the homework itself? Is that a question about student planning? Is that a question about student advocacy? Or is it, there's so many questions in there, but we try to break it down into the skill that we're not seeing and then how we can intentionally build that skill. So the other piece is again, what do we need to do? How clear is our vision about learning? In part one, I talked about our portrait of a graduate, which has a well-rounded learner defined, not just with the learning, but as a learner. And so we really ask about reflective questions as what are some lessons that people have that really align well to nurturing a powerful learner while they're becoming a proficient student? Or how well does our portrait of a graduate being the skills being used for students in that? And then last but not least, to answer that question is we try to get really narrow with certain grade levels and certain departments. So what is it you'd really like to see out of your math department or math students as they're learning math? Whether it's about problem solving or a level of resourcefulness, or what is it we really want to see about our developing writers, or what is it we really want to see in terms of science and things like that. And for example, our science team really wanted students to have greater voice in presenting their thinking and their findings during labs, rather than just do a lab and turn it in. They wanted a lot more sharing and reflection, just to have kids share their thinking out loud and with other kids. So hopefully that helps, but just really trying to get narrow with what are we hearing people talk about and how does that align to our direction that we want to go with these imagined statements. It was subtly in here, but it shouldn't be subtle, which is there are many things that people are doing already that you could say, oh yeah, this teacher does that, we do this, we do that. Part of our goal is to see how clear we are on what we're doing and how well it aligns to where you're going. So it's not a teacher, but it's systemic, or that we do a celebration of those pieces. So many of the things that we do in our work is we try to share artifacts or do a treasure hunt for these examples. So when we talk about what are examples of lesson plans that allow students to self-assess, what are examples of learning experiences or plans that you have? And that went back to the XY axis of students learning at a high level as well as being empowered, and people sharing out examples or two of that quadrant, because we believe as a professional staff, the more that we share, the more that we're sharing what we're doing in that quadrant, the more aha moments that people get in terms of seeing what's possible with kids, as well as the more they see, oh, they're being asked to do that in science. Well, I could probably ask the same thing of that here in art, or I can ask, and it really aligns, not just, it's like a vertical alignment of what we expect kids to have in terms of skill development in their role, as much as we would have sort of a vertical alignment with curriculum in terms of what we want them to learn. And Michael put in that they give cash to everybody. Actually, if you see in the chat, about so the great acronym there.
Yeah, I used to push back on what is the difference between like a goal and hope. And he said a goal is your hope that you write down.
Well, I can give a quick preview to part 3. We had some people that were with us this morning that weren't with part 2. We had people that are here with part 2 that could be with part 3 or not. But our goal on our sessions today on our leading and learning without boundaries series. This is really a preview day to see parts 1, 2, and 3. Our work has been to work with school districts, to be able to work with coaches and school leaders on these important concepts, and really helping to frame for their school and for their district the concept around powerful learner, really pushing more intentionally around these imagining these learning experiences becoming not just by chance but intentional. And then part 3 really gets into really a learner-centered ecosystem that really includes learning, but beyond the boundary. So not just school, but a student's own network, our communities and our cities, and really thinking beyond the boundaries that we've broken through. We know that COVID has been a major challenge for America and for students and for educators in our industry. But it's also been a disruptive sort of innovator in many ways for industries. And we believe that while we are looking forward in many ways to getting back to many of the great things that we do with families and friends and communities, and especially inside of schools, we also do believe that there were some areas that had pushed our system to over the edge in some ways that we can create some new boundaries for how we better meet the needs of kids, instructional strategies that can be used to really empower learners. And then as part 3 is going to get into, is really just redefining our ecosystem of learning from place-based to just having the equation that doesn't even necessarily have a place, but just has the equation about what great learning experiences are and how do we build those together. So thank you again for joining us here today. If you need anything, again, this is our preview day. We're going to be having some cohorts in the summer for teams that would be a much deeper dive into not only the rule of 3, but into really some action planning and next steps. If you need anything, don't hesitate to let us know. If you need anything from resources to connections, and thank you for engaging with Jamboard, the chat box, and sharing ideas.
All right, thank you, Ryan. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.